They executed humanity's woman. Commander, the 900-year galactic peace ended in flames. I was eating cold noodles in my quarters when the broadcast started. It came through every channel at once, every screen on every human ship in the Velar sect lit up. Ominously, there was no warning, no static, just the sudden crisp image of a woman standing on a raised platform in the center of the galactic conclave chamber, surrounded by 11 alien delegates in their ceremonial robes, and I recognized her immediately because I had known her for 20 years, Commander Yara. Solon stood straight. Her hands were bound in front of her with silver restraints that caught the light of the chamber. Her uniform had been stripped of its rank insignia. They had done that deliberately. They wanted every human watching to see a woman, not a commander. They wanted us to see someone small. They did not know Yara. She did not look at the floor. She did not look at the delegates. She looked directly into the broadcast lens, and I understood in that moment that she had known the camera was there and had chosen exactly where to aim her gaze. She was looking at us, all 14 billion of us scattered across 6 star systems, watching on screens in mess halls and engine rooms and observation decks. She looked directly at every single one of us, and her expression said one thing without a word: remember this. Head delegate, a towering Raxi named Counselor Orith, read the formal charges in a flat mechanical voice. The charges were absurd. They accused Yara of inciting species aggression. They cited her formal proposal at the conclave summit 3 months earlier, in which she had argued that humanity deserved equal military representation and the right to defend our own colonies without requesting permission from the conclave's joint authority. That was the crime, asking to be treated as equals. I set my fork down. Orith finished reading. There was no rebuttal. There was no defense attorney. There was no trial record entered into evidence. The conclave had voted on the matter the previous day in a closed session to which no human representative had been invited, and the vote had been unanimous. Yara had been given no opportunity to speak. They carried out the sentence in front of the lens, right there in the chamber. I will not describe what I watched. I will only say that it lasted less than 30 seconds, and when it was over, Counselor Oreth stepped forward and looked into that same broadcast camera with an expression that I can only describe as satisfaction. Then he spoke the sentence that every human being alive would remember for the rest of their lives. Humanity is reminded of its place. The broadcast ended. My quarters were silent. I sat there for a long time. Noodles had gone completely cold. Single light above my bunk hummed at its usual frequency. Through the porthole to my left, I could see the edge of the Valor Nebula, that enormous slow-burning curtain of red and gold gas that our ship had been patrolling for the past 6 weeks. It was beautiful in the way that distant, indifferent things are beautiful. It did not care what had just happened. The universe did not care. Only we did. I thought about Yara. I had met her on my first assignment out of the academy 22 years ago aboard the long-range survey vessel Arden Crossing. She had been a junior tactical officer, and I had been the most nervous ensign on the ship. She was the kind of person who walked into a room and made it immediately clear that she had already thought about every possible problem in that room and had solutions ready, not arrogant, there is a difference, and Yara understood the difference better than anyone I had ever served alongside. Over 2 decades, I had watched her rise through every rank the human Expeditionary Command had. Watched her negotiate the Callaway trade agreement with the Donikai while standing on a broken ankle she had not mentioned to anyone. I had watched her deliver the eulogy for 14 crew members after the Farpoint Station accident, and she had spoken every name from memory without notes, without pause, because she had memorized them the night before, because she believed every person deserved to be named properly. I had watched her spend 3 years drafting the proposal that had gotten her killed, working late in her office with cold tea and a stack of reference treaties going back 6 centuries of galactic law, because she genuinely believed that a well-reasoned argument presented with sufficient evidence would move the conclave. She had been right about almost everything in her life. She had been wrong about that. I stood up and walked to my desk and turned on my personal comm panel. I opened a channel to my bridge crew and told them to bring all systems standby. Readiness. Voice sounded strange to me. Very calm, very steady, like a person standing at the edge of something enormous, looking down, deciding. My first officer, Lieutenant Commander Dale O'Connell, appeared on my secondary screen within 4 minutes. He had clearly just come from the observation lounge, where most of the crew had been watching. His eyes were red. He was 29 years old and had joined the fleet because he wanted to map star systems and write papers about pulsar formation. He was one of the finest officers I had ever had under my command. He said nothing. He just looked at me. I said, "Standby readiness, Dale. All departments." He nodded once. He turned away and began giving orders. I pulled up the tactical display and looked at the positions of every human vessel in the sector. 17 ships spread across a region roughly 40 light minutes wide. All of them were on normal patrol rotation. All of them had been watching the same broadcast. I switched the broadband military frequency, and the channel was completely silent. That silence told me everything. I had served in the fleet for over 2 decades. In that time, I had heard that frequency carry arguments, jokes, music, emergency alerts, policy debates, weather data, system status reports, complaints about ration quality, and every other kind of communication that human beings generate when they are living and working together across the void of space. I had never, not once, heard every human ship in a sector go completely silent at the same time. We were not grieving. Grief makes noise. Grief is loud and ragged and unpredictable. What I was hearing in that silence was something else entirely. It was 14 billion people arriving at the same conclusion simultaneously, and that conclusion had no sound because it did not need one. I thought about the 17 ships visible on my display. I thought about the other fleets in the other sectors. I thought about the orbital platforms and the deep rain stations and the colony defense grids that the conclave had never asked about, and we had never mentioned. An encrypted message arrived on my personal terminal. Single source, Earth War Council. No header, no greeting, no signature. It said, "Remember the Meridian Protocol." I leaned back in my chair and looked at the ceiling of my quarters for a long moment. The Meridian Protocol. I had been briefed on it during my promotion to admiral in a room with no windows and a security classification so high that the folder containing it had been physically destroyed in front of me. After I finished reading, it was not a contingency plan. Contingency plans are for things you hope will not happen. Meridian Protocol was a certainty plan. It was built for the day we all knew was coming, the day the conclave finally went too far, and it had been constructed and maintained and quietly updated for almost 2 centuries by engineers and commanders and intelligence officers whose names would never appear in any public record. Yara had known about it. She had updated it herself 3 years ago, adding the final activation sequence. She had been preparing for this even while she was writing her proposal, even while she was building her careful, evidence-based, legally rigorous argument for peaceful reform. She had also been making sure that if the conclave answered with something like this, humanity would not be caught empty-handed. She had looked into that camera and said, "Remember this." She had known. I pressed the acknowledgement key on my terminal. 6 characters, that was all it required. Somewhere on Earth and on 12 other worlds, similar terminals were receiving similar messages, and similar hands were pressing similar keys. I got up, straightened my uniform, and walked to the bridge. The crew was already at their stations. No one spoke as I walked to the command chair. I sat down, looked at the view screen, and looked at the stars. The Valor Nebula burned silently at the edge of my field of vision. Dale was standing at his station to my left. He looked at me. I said quietly, "Tell the fleet we are moving to full operational status. All weapon systems to be brought online. All crew to battle positions." I paused. "And tell them why?" He said. "They already know why." "Admiral," I nodded. "Tell them anyway." "Say her name." He turned to his comm panel. I heard him begin to speak. I heard him say Yara Solon's name in a clear, steady voice over the fleet-wide channel, and I heard the silence that followed it, and then I heard, one by one across 17 ships, the sound of 17 crews responding. We were done being reminded of our place. We had decided on a new one. The conclave expected protests. They had modeled our response 18 different ways, using behavioral data collected over 3 centuries of observation, and in every model the outcome was the same. Humanity would issue formal statements of outrage. We would demand a tribunal. We would file petitions. We would hold memorial broadcasts. We would talk about what had happened for months, and then gradually the noise would fade, because it always had before. They were working from the wrong data set. They had been watching us at peace. They had never watched us at war. The first thing that happened in the 12 hours after the broadcast was nothing publicly, visibly nothing. No fleet movements, no emergency transmissions, no dramatic speeches from Earth leadership. The conclave's monitoring stations recorded normal traffic patterns across all human space. A few civilian networks ran memorial broadcasts. Some politicians gave statements. Everything looked like the model. Underneath that surface, 11 fleets activated simultaneously. I was in my command chair aboard the unbroken Meridian when the activation confirmation came in. My screen lit up with fleet signatures, one after another, each one appearing as a small amber point of light on the tactical display. I watched them come online in sequence, and I counted under my breath the way you count without thinking when the number matters. 11 fleets, 462 ships. Across 6 star systems, every vessel carried weapons that did not exist on any conclave inspection manifest because they had been built into the cargo infrastructure of what looked from the outside like standard freight and survey vessels. The unbroken Meridian itself appeared in conclave records as a long-range patrol and survey ship with standard defensive armament that was accurate as far as it went. It simply did not go very far. Yara had overseen the final integration phase of the armament program herself 2 years before her mission to the conclave summit. She had walked through every ship personally, reviewed every modification, signed off on every weapons test report. She had done it methodically and without urgency, the way she did everything, and when she was finished, she had filed the review under a classification code that only 3 people in the entire fleet could access. Now those weapons were live, and the 3 people who could access that classification code were all pressing the same key. I want to explain something about the armament program, because it matters to understanding what came next. For 300 years, humanity had accepted a condition of enforced military limitation as part of our membership in the Galactic Conclave. We were permitted defensive systems. We were permitted patrol craft. We were not permitted capital warships, mass driver arrays, or any weapon system that the Conclave classified as offensive. This was framed to us as a condition of galactic peace. It was framed to us as an honor, the responsible restraint expected of a civilized species. What it actually was, as any child who had ever been told to sit quietly and not cause trouble could recognize, was control. The engineers who built the Meridian protocol did not announce what they were doing. They did not publish papers. They did not file patents. They worked in shift patterns, rotated often enough that no single worker ever saw the complete picture of what was being constructed. The ships that carried the modifications were refitted in deep dock facilities on the outer colonies, away from the Conclave's inspection routes, in bays that were listed in public records as atmospheric processing maintenance centers. It'd take 200 and the concentrated effort of thousands of people who had each simply decided, quietly and without drama, that they were not going to leave their children in the same position they had inherited. I had met some of those engineers. I had served alongside some of their children. I knew a woman named Caroline Adu who had spent 14 years as a propulsion technician on the outer docks before I understood what she had actually been building. When the activation order went out, she was aboard the carrier-class vessel, Brett. Safest reach, 3 star systems away. From my position, I thought about her. When the fleet signatures came up on my screen, I thought about all the Carolines, all the quiet professionals who had done their part and gone back to their quarters and eaten their dinners and never said a word. Yara had said thank you to every one of them personally before she left for the summit. She had known she might not come back. She had made sure they knew she understood what they had done. The second thing that happened in those 12 hours was that our intelligence network, which the Conclave also did not know existed, began feeding us real-time data from inside the Conclave's own communication channels. What we found was instructive. The Conclave Military Command had spent the 12 hours after the broadcast congratulating themselves. There were Intercepts of senior officials toasting. The decision, there were messages. Between conclave admirals using language. About humanity that I will not repeat here, but that told me everything I needed to know about how we had been. Regarded how we had always been. Regarded behind the formal diplomatic language and the polite smiles. There was one message that my intelligence officer, Lieutenant Petra Owens, flagged and put on my screen with a note that said simply, "You should read this." It was from the conclave's chief military strategist, a Raxi general named Corathville, addressed to the Joint Military Council. It said in its entirety, the response from the human species will be negligible. They have no offensive capability, no unified command structure capable of rapid mobilization, and no historical precedent for coordinated military action at scale. They will protest, they will petition. In 6 months, they will accept whatever terms we offer because they have no alternative. Do not waste monitoring resources on this matter. I read it twice. I handed my tablet to Dale. He read it and looked at me. I said, "Save that," he said. "Already saved, Admiral. I'm going to have it framed by the time the conclave's monitoring systems began registering something unusual in human space. We had already been moving for 9 hours. The unusual thing they registered was, of course, the ship's 462 vessels that had previously appeared on conclave sensors as civilian and patrol craft had reconfigured their emission signatures. You cannot hide the signature of a mass driver charging cycle, not at close range, and we were no longer trying to hide anything. The conclave sent a formal inquiry, standard diplomatic language, requesting clarification of fleet movements. My communications officer, Ensign Owen Beckett, the youngest person on the bridge and a man who had been in the fleet for exactly 14 months, looked at me and asked how I wanted to respond. I told him to log the message as received and take no further action. He nodded and turned back to his station, and I could see from the set of his shoulders that he understood exactly what that meant. The conclave sent a second message 4 hours later. The language was less formal. It used words like concern and stability and the importance of maintaining the structures of galactic peace. I told Owen to log it as received. Then I want to tell you about something that happened at hour 23, because it is the thing I think about most when I think about those early hours and what we were capable of. My navigator, Ensign Lily Farrow, was 24 years old. She had joined the fleet from a civilian engineering program on the colony of Caldwell Station, where she had grown up in a settlement of about 8,000 people. She had never seen a battle. She had never fired a weapon in anger. She sat at her navigation console with her hair pulled back and her focus completely locked on her screens, and she worked for 7 hours straight without a break, rewriting the targeting integration protocol for our fleet's fire control network. This is what that means in practical terms. The targeting protocol we were using had been designed for patrol operations. It was accurate and reliable for its intended purpose, but it was not designed for coordinated offensive action across a multi-ship formation operating at high velocity. The existing system had a synchronization lag that, under combat conditions, would create gaps in our coverage pattern. Those gaps were not large, but they were there, and against A defensive grid, there would be nothing small about the price of those gaps. Lily found them. She found all of them. Mapped the problem, designed a solution. Wrote the correction into the base code. Tested it against a simulation model she built herself in the same session, found 3 secondary errors in her first draft, corrected those and ran the full simulation again. She did all of this in 7 hours on a navigation console using a tablet she had balanced on the edge of her terminal. Because the console did have enough screen space for what she needed. When she finished, she turned around in her chair and said, "Admiral, I have targeting integration correction ready. For fleet-wide upload, it should close. The synchronization lagged completely. I tested it against a defensive grid simulation. I think it will work." I looked at her for a moment. 24 years old, 7 hours, a tablet. The Conclave had an artificial intelligence system called the Concordance Network that handled targeting integration for their entire fleet. It had been developed over 60 years by a team of several hundred engineers and had been continuously updated ever since. It was considered the most sophisticated tactical AI in the known galaxy. Lily had just done the same job in 7 hours because she was angry and she was good and she had not slept and she had not complained once. I said, "Upload it fleet-wide, Ensign." She turned back to her console and began the upload. I looked at the stars outside the view screen and I thought about what the Conclave's chief military strategist had written: no historical precedent for coordinated military action at scale. He was right that we had no precedent. He had drawn completely the wrong conclusion from that fact. We had no precedent because we had been patient, because for 300 years we had chosen the path of diplomacy and restraint and good faith engagement, and we had sent our best people, our most careful and principled people, to argue for a better arrangement, and Yara Solon had been the finest of all of them. She had gone to that summit with 20 years of work in her hands, and she had stood before the conclave and made the case for our dignity with more clarity and more evidence than anyone had managed before. And they had put her on a platform and ended her in front of all of us and told us to remember our place. The targeting integration upload completed at hour 23. I watched the confirmation signals come in from across the fleet one by one until all 462 ships had confirmed receipt. Then I opened the fleet-wide channel. I said, "This is Admiral Morris. Aboard the Unbroken Meridian, every one of you has seen what they did. Every one of you knows why we are here. I want to say one thing before we move." I paused for a moment. Outside the view screen, the stars were exactly as they had always been, cold and permanent and indifferent, and I thought about Yara looking into that camera. We are not doing this because we are angry. Anger burns out. We are doing this because what happened was wrong, and because what has always happened to us has always been wrong, and because the only language left is the one we were never supposed to learn to speak. Another pause. Commander Solon prepared us for this. She worked for 20 years so that when this moment came, we would be ready. Don't waste her work. I closed the channel. The conclave sent a third message. Swen did not use the word concern, it used the word warning. I told Owen to log it as received. Then I gave the order to move the 462 ships of the Human Expeditionary Command came about simultaneously. The formation spread across a front 3 light minutes wide, and at the leading edge of that formation, the unbroken meridian accelerated into deep space toward the conclave's home system. From the outside, I imagine it looked like a door opening. From the inside, it felt like one closing. The threshold defense grid was the single most celebrated military structure in the history of the Galactic Conclave. It had been constructed over a period of 40 years following the last major conflict in galactic history, which was itself 9 centuries old, and it guarded the approach to the Conclave's home system through a narrow corridor of navigable space between 2 dense asteroid fields. The grid consisted of 11 planetary-scale weapons platforms, a network of automated interceptor stations, a dedicated fleet of 80 warships, and the Concordance targeting network, which processed threat data across all elements simultaneously. No force in galactic history had ever attempted to breach it. The reason no force had ever attempted it was not because the task was considered impossible. The reason was that for 9 centuries no force had possessed both the motivation and the capability at the same time. We possessed both. I want to be honest about what we knew going in. We knew the grid's published specifications, which were considerable. We knew its patrol patterns, its response protocols, and the firing arcs of its weapons platforms, because Yara's intelligence network had been collecting that data for years. What we did not know was how it would perform under the specific conditions of our attack, because those conditions had never existed before. We were not fighting the way the Conclave expected forces to fight. We did not have 9 centuries of warfare doctrine built into our tactics. We had something the Conclave's tactical models could not account for, which was no doctrine at all. Here is what I mean by that. Every spacefaring civilization that had ever engaged in military conflict developed over generations of warfare a set of tactical conventions, attack vectors, formation patterns, engagement distances, withdrawal protocol. These conventions became so deeply embedded in military culture that they were essentially invisible. Commanders followed them not because they had consciously chosen to, but because they had trained under officers who had trained under officers, and the conventions had been refined by centuries of experience until they represented the accumulated wisdom of thousands of engagements. The Conclave's tactical AI, the Concordance network, had been trained on that accumulated wisdom. It was extraordinarily good at modeling conventional warfare, because conventional warfare was all it had ever seen. We had no conventions. We had been a junior species under military limitation. For 300 years, we had no tradition of offensive fleet action because we had never conducted offensive fleet action. What we had was a group of officers who had spent their careers on patrol duty, exploration, and escort missions, thinking carefully about hypothetical problems they had never expected to actually face, and a navigator named Lily Ferraro, who had spent 7 sleepless hours rewriting targeting protocols on a borrowed tablet. Attack pattern we used at the threshold was not elegant. A Conclave military historian reviewing it afterward described it, I was later told, as looking like controlled chaos. That description was accurate and also completely missed the point. It was not controlled chaos. It was deliberate. Unpredictability, which is a different thing entirely, deliberate. Unpredictability requires more discipline than formal tactics, not less, because every ship in the formation has to simultaneously execute a precise maneuver while appearing to be doing something random. Our first wave came in at an angle the grid's models had assigned a low probability of approach, not because we had calculated the models, but because the angle gave us the best approach geometry for our specific weapon loadout. The concordance network spent critical seconds assigning threat priority to our formation because our configuration did not match any historical attack profile in its database. Those seconds cost the grids automated interceptor stations their first response window. I watched the grid's platforms begin to rotate, and I watched the interceptor stations fire their first salvo, and I watched 23 of our ships take hits that damaged their forward systems. I had known this would happen in any engagement at this scale. You take damage. The question is whether you take damage that stops you or damage that slows you, and the answer depends entirely on what you do in the next 60 seconds. I gave the order I had been planning for 2 days. 12 ships peeled away from the main formation and moved on a converging course toward the 3 westernmost grid platforms. They were not our strongest ships, they were our fastest with the lightest weapon loadout and the most experienced pilots in the fleet. They were also, every one of them, crewed by volunteers, because what I had asked them to do carried higher risk than anything else in the engagement plan. I had asked every commander personally, and every one of them had said yes before I finished the sentence. Their job was to get inside the grid's minimum engagement distance. At that range, the large platforms could not depress their main weapons sufficiently to target them. The interceptors could, but by the time our 12 fast ships reached minimum engagement distance, the main formation had the interceptor stations occupied. It worked not cleanly. Nothing works cleanly, but it worked, and the gap it created in the grid's western coverage arc was exactly the gap I had planned for the second wave to use. The second wave was led by the carrier Arden. Crossing, I had chosen the name deliberately. It was the ship where I had first served alongside Yara 22 years ago, and its captain was a woman named Susan Hollis, who had known Yara longer than I had, and who had spent the entire 3-day transit from the Velar sector sitting in her command chair reading Yara's summit proposal for the 14th time. Susan took the Arden, or the crossing through the Western Gap at full drive power with 30 ships behind her, and she hit the interior of the grid formation before the concordance network had completed its threat reassessment. I was on the fleet command channel for all of it. I heard Susan's voice absolutely steady, calling coordinates and firing solutions to her crew as if she were running a routine training exercise. I heard her weapons officer, a man named Arthur Crane, who was 51 years old and had been in the fleet for 30 years, and had the unhurried calm of someone who had thought carefully about exactly this kind of moment for a very long time. I heard the sounds behind their voices, the sounds of a ship in combat, and I kept my focus on the tactical display, and I tracked every vessel in the formation, and I did not let myself think about anything except the next decision. The Conclave's defending fleet responded to the grid breach by attempting to Reform its patrol pattern. This was the correct doctrine. Close the gap, restore coverage, contain the intrusion. The Concordance Network would have identified this as the optimal response. In under 2 seconds, the problem was that our third wave was already positioned to intercept the reform maneuver I had planned for the Concordance Network's optimal response, because the optimal response was always the same. That is what optimal means. The Conclave Admiral commanding the defense of Raxi, named Fleet Commander Sareth, opened a hail on the universal frequency at the moment his reform pattern began to fail. His voice, translated through our communication systems, was tightly controlled, but not perfectly controlled. I could hear in it something that was not quite fear, but was adjacent to fear. He asked me why we were not respecting the accord of engagement, the formal code that governed military conduct between Conclave member species. I opened the channel and said, Fleet Commander. Commander Solon was observing every protocol available to her when your council decided how to respond. We are not feeling particularly bound by protocols today. There was a pause. Then he said in a different tone, something I did not expect. He said, Admiral, this does not have to. I closed the channel, not in anger. Clarity. The battle continued for 4 more hours. I will not give you a number for the ships we lost, not because I am hiding it, but because the number belongs to the families and the crew. Records not to a broad account. I will say that I said every name in my head. During those 4 hours, every damage report that came through the command channel, every confirmation of a vessel down, I said the name of the ship, and I filed it somewhere inside myself where I intended to keep it. This is not sentiment. This is what command requires. You are responsible for everyone who follows you, and that responsibility does not diminish when the news is bad. It intensifies. We breached the threshold at hour 4. The 12 fast ships from the first wave had been in close engagement with 3 grid platforms for the entire battle. At hour 3 and 40 minutes, with the western corridor secure and the main conclave defending fleet in a containment position they could not sustain, those 12 ships completed a maneuver that Lily Pharaoh's corrected targeting protocol had made possible. They coordinated a simultaneous strike sequence with less than a half-second synchronization gap. The 3 platforms went dark within 40 seconds of each other, with the platforms down and the defending fleet contained. The path to the conclave's flagship was open. Sareth had moved the flagship, the Eternal Concordance, to the rear of his formation when the breach became clear. It was the correct decision. The flagship carried the Concordance Network's primary processing core, and it carried the Conclave's senior diplomatic and military staff, and it had not been designed to serve as a frontline combat vessel. Moving it rearward was doctrine I did not pursue. The flagship with missiles or mass driver fire, I sent boarding teams. When I announced this intention on the command channel, there was a silence from my senior officers that lasted about 3 seconds, and then Dale said, Admiral, a boarding action against the Conclave flagship is not in the engagement plan. I said, it is now. He said, on what tactical basis? I said, because it matters. I looked at the view screen. Because destroying that ship from a distance means nothing. Because the Conclave needs to understand that we are not fighting from far away. And because Yara Solon deserved to have humanity stand in the place where they decided what to do to her. Dale was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Boarding teams are ready, Admiral." Boarding took 90 minutes. The Eternal Concordance was a large vessel, and its crew had not been trained for internal defense operations because no one had ever boarded a Conclave flagship before. In 900 years of galactic history, our boarding teams were not trained for it. Either, not in the traditional sense, but they were human beings in a narrow corridor with a clear objective, and that turns out to be a combination that is very difficult to stop. Fleet Commander Sarath surrendered the flagship at the end of the 90 minutes. He met me at the entrance to the command bridge, and he looked at me with an expression that I recognized as something alien species wear when they are recalculating everything they thought they knew. He was very tall. His robes were formal. He held himself with great dignity. Even then, he said in translated words, "I did not think you would come this far." I said, "I know." I walked past him onto the bridge of the Eternal Concordance. The command chair was in the center of the room, raised slightly on a platform flanked by consoles on both sides. The chair was empty. I walked to it and stood in front of it for a moment. Then I reached into the breast pocket of my uniform and took out the small metal badge I had been carrying since the morning of the broadcast, Yara's commission badge. I had taken it from the memorial display outside her old office on the Arden crossing before we left for the threshold. I held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the familiar engraved edge. I set it on the arm of the command chair. I looked at it there, in the center of that room. Then I turned and told Dale to begin securing the vessel. We had expected the Conclave to fight back harder. We had models, our own models built by our own intelligence teams over years of careful analysis. And those models had projected that the breach of the threshold would trigger an immediate counter-mobilization from reserve fleets that the Conclave kept at 3 other system points. The models gave us good odds, but they gave us difficult odds. And in the 2 days after the threshold battle, I slept 3 hours and spent the rest of the time watching the tactical displays for the signatures of incoming Conclave reserve forces. They did not come. What came instead, beginning at hour 36 after the battle, were messages from species we had not expected to hear from at all. The first was from the Velhari, a species who occupied 2 star systems in the outer Conclave territories. They were a quiet people, physically small, with a reputation in the Conclave for extreme diplomatic caution. They had been members of the Conclave for over 400 years, and in all that time had never once voted against the consensus of the major species or raised a formal dispute. The Conclave thought of them, to the extent they thought of them at all, as reliable and unobtrusive. Their message was addressed to me personally. It was brief. It said, "Admiral Marish, we have watched what was done to your Commander Solon for many years, in different forms applied to different species. We did not have the courage to say so. We are saying so now. The Velhari people stand in support of your action and ask only that whatever is built afterward is built with voices like ours included in it. We have been afraid to speak for a very long time." I read that message 3 times. Second was from the Junikai, who were one of the larger Conclave member species with a significant fleet of their own. Their message was longer and More formal, but the substance was the same. They had suffered their own version of enforced limitation, different in detail, but identical in spirit, and the sight of humanity moving had caused something to shift inside their own councils. They offered assistance if we needed it. They asked for nothing in return except to be part of whatever came next. The third message was from a species called the Amari, who I had known existed but had never encountered directly. They were ancient, far older than the conclave itself, and they had been members since before the current legal framework had been established. They had always seemed like the establishment to me, a species so embedded in the existing order that they were essentially part of it. Their message surprised me more than the others. The Amari elder who sent the message said in precise and careful translation, "We have watched the conclave for 4 centuries, and we have known for much of that time that it had grown into something its founders did not intend. We are not a young species. We have seen what happens to structures that cannot reform themselves. We watched your Commander Solon make her case 3 months ago, and we voted against her proposal, not because we disagreed with it, but because we were afraid of the consequences. That was a failure of courage on our part, we say. So now, because we believe it must be said." I was sitting in my command chair when that message finished playing, and I found that I had nothing to say in response for a long moment. Not because I was moved, though I was, but because the message had shifted something fundamental in how I was thinking about what we were doing. We had come here for Yara. We had come because what they had done was wrong, and because we were not going to accept it, and because 3 centuries of being told to remember our place had accumulated into a pressure that the conclave's action had finally released. That was real, that was honest. I'm not going to dress it up as something more noble than it was, because it was at its core a response to a profound injustice, and anyone who tells you that that is not sufficient motivation has never watched someone they respected die on a broadcast screen. But now the Velhari were reaching out, the Denikai, the Amari, and behind them, as the next 18 hours brought more messages, 6 other species who had been sitting quietly inside the conclave structure for generations, not because they were comfortable, but because they had not seen a path out. My senior staff gathered in the briefing room of the Unbroken Meridian on the morning of day 3 after the threshold. I looked around the table at the people I had served with for years. Dale, who had not slept more than 5 hours in 3 days and was running entirely on conviction and cold coffee. Lily Farrow, who had been promoted to full lieutenant that morning by my direct authority, and who sat at the table with the slightly dazed expression of someone who had not yet processed how quickly her life had changed. Petra Owens, my intelligence officer, who had a tablet in front of her with 9 incoming diplomatic contacts queued for attention. Arthur Crane, who had come aboard from the Arden Crossing to serve as tactical coordinator, and who sat with his hands folded and his expression thoughtful. I looked at them and I said, "The Conclave's reserve fleets have not mobilized. They have made contact through back channels, asking to negotiate terms. They are offering full reparations. They are offering Yara's proposal, every item of it implemented immediately, equal military representation, colony defense, Autonomy, renegotiated trade terms. Formal apology entered into the record. I paused. They are offering everything. She asked for because they are afraid. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Lily said quietly, that's everything she wanted though, isn't it? That's the whole proposal. I said yes. She said, so why do you sound like you're not going to take it? That was the question. I had been turning it over in my mind. For 12 hours, the conclave's offer was genuine in the sense that they would follow through on it, at least for now. Because they were afraid of us in a way they had never been before. But fear is not the same as understanding. An agreement made because one party is afraid does not carry the same weight as an agreement made because both parties recognize the same truth. The conclave was not offering us Yara's proposal because they had concluded it was right. They were offering it because we had taken their flagship and shut down their threshold grid, and because they did not want to find out what came next in 5 years and 10 when the fear had faded and the political climate inside the conclave had shifted. What would hold that agreement in place? What had held the 900-year peace in place? Nothing that had worked for us, nothing that had saved Yara, Arthur said from the end of the table. So what are we doing instead? I said. The Vilhari, the Dunakai, the Amori, and 6 other species have reached out. They are not offering assistance out of opportunism. They are reaching out because what happened here opened a door they had been waiting for. They want to be part of building something different. I looked around the table. I think we need to decide whether this is a punitive action or whether it is something else. Dale said, what is the something else? I said, a new structure, not the conclave as it exists, something that starts from the principle that the Solon proposal was not a request for a favor. It was a statement of what is simply right. The room was quiet. Then Petra said, the War Council will have to vote on any major policy change. I said, yes, I know. I looked at my terminal. I'm going to recommend it to them. Dale said, and if they want to take the conclave's offer instead? I said, then we take it and we watch very carefully for a very long time, and we build the pressure to hold it in place by other means. But I am going to argue against that option. I looked at the table. Yara did not spend 20 years building a proposal for a better arrangement within the existing system. She spent 20 years proving that the existing system could not produce better arrangement by itself. I paused. They killed her for telling the truth. The least we can do is act on it. The briefing ended. I sat alone in the room. For a while after the others left, I read Yara's proposal one more time, the full text, all 68 pages of it, footnotes and the legal precedents and the careful, thorough, humane reasoning that she had put into every sentence. I thought about her in her office late at night with cold tea and a stack of reference materials, believing that a well-made argument could move the conclave. She had been right about that, too, in the end, just not in the way she had expected. Her argument had moved us. I sent my recommendation to the War Council that evening. I made the case for a new framework rather than an amended old one, for a founding document rather than a revised treaty, for a structure built with the Velhari and the Dunakai and the Amari and everyone else who had been waiting for the door to open. I made the case for doing it properly without haste, 'cause the people who came after us would live inside Whatever we built here, and they deserved something built with care. The War Council met for 6 hours. I waited. The reply came at midnight ship time. From Council Chair Nathan Howe, a man I had never met but whose voice I recognized from 100 official broadcasts. It was 4 sentences. It said, recommendation approved, new framework authorized, you are hereby appointed special envoy for Foundation. Negotiations pending formal ratification. Do not rush it. She would have wanted it done right. I transmitted to all fleets the next morning. I said, new mission. We are not going home. We are making a new one. The negotiations took 2 years. I'm not going to pretend it was easy. Easy is not the word that fits. The conclave's senior leadership did not accept gracefully the reduction in their authority that the new framework required. There were 3 separate attempts to stall the process through procedural objections. There was a period of 4 months during which the Vraxi delegation refused to attend sessions at all, and we negotiated around them by direct agreement with the other species until their absence became more costly to them than their presence. And they came back. There were moments when I sat in a room with delegates from 11 species and felt the weight of exactly what was being attempted, which was the deliberate reconstruction of the political order that had governed all known space for 9 centuries, and the weight of that was significant, but it moved slowly, with setbacks, with arguments that ran into the early hours and compromised language that took weeks to agree on, with moments of breakthrough and moments of frustration. It moved because the Velhari were patient and precise, because the Danakai brought legal expertise that matched anything the Conclave's own teams could produce, because the Amari brought something more valuable than any of that, which was the weight of genuine historical perspective, because our own team, led by a civilian diplomat named Grace Ellery, who I had requested specifically from the War Council because she had been one of Yara's closest colleagues, was extraordinary. Grace had known Yara for 15 years. She had worked alongside her on the original proposal, and she carried that document in her head the way some people carry a language. She knew every argument in it, and she knew why every argument had been constructed the way it had. When the negotiation stalled, she went back to the text and found the passage that addressed the sticking point, because Yara had anticipated almost every sticking point, and Grace would read it aloud in the session room in her clear, unhurried voice, and the room would understand, usually, that the answer had been there all along. The document we produced was called the Soul in Covenant. It was not named by me. It was the Amari elder who proposed the name in a session on the 419th day of negotiations, and when she proposed it, the room was quiet for a long time. Then the Valhari lead delegate, a small, soft-spoken person named Arn Voss, who I had come to regard as one of the most careful minds I had ever encountered, said simply, "Yes, that name is right," and no one objected. The Soul in Covenant established as its foundational principles the right of every member species to equal military standing, the absolute requirement for open tribunal in any action taken against an individual or species by the governing body, the right of any species to withdraw from the governing body without penalty, and the requirement that the governing council include representatives from every member species with equal voting weight. Regardless of fleet size, population, or economic standing, these were Yara's principles. Every one of them was in the proposal she had brought to the conclave summit. Every one of them had been rejected. Every one of them was now the law of galactic civilization. The trials of the individuals responsible for Yara's execution were conducted under the covenant, which meant they were conducted with defense counsel, presented evidence, allowed cross-examination, and ran for 8 months. Counselor Orith and 6 members of the council who had voted for and overseen what happened received sentences I will not detail here, other than to say that the tribunal was deliberate in ensuring that the sentences reflected the gravity of what had been done without mimicking the nature of it. We were very specifically not doing to them what they had done to Yara. That distinction was made explicit in the tribunal record and in the public statement that accompanied the verdicts. The record said, "This tribunal holds that the standard we apply to our adversaries must be the standard we apply to ourselves." Commander Solon was executed without trial, without defense, without evidence presented before an impartial body. The verdicts rendered today are the result of 8 months of exactly those processes. The contrast is intentional. It is the point. I was present for the reading of the verdicts. I sat in the gallery with Dale, who had been promoted to captain in the months since the threshold, and with Lily Ferraro, who is now a full commander and had been assigned to lead the fleet's new tactical development program, a role she had been recommended for by every senior officer she had ever worked under. Arthur Crane sat 2 rows behind me. Grace Ellery was at the front of the gallery next to the Amari elder, who I had come to know well in the 2 years of negotiations, and whose name, in its closest translated form, was Elarath. When the verdicts were read, Elarath turned and looked at me. Her face was difficult for me to read, as alien faces often are, but I had learned her expressions over 2 years of close work, and what I saw was something I can only describe as a long wait being set down. The ceremony for the formal adoption of the Solon Covenant took place on neutral ground, a space station called the Renan Waypoint in the outer territories, chosen because it belonged to no single species. Every signatory species sent their senior representative. 41 species signed. The conclave, as it had previously existed, ceased to exist on the day the covenant went into effect. It was replaced formally and legally by what is now called the Free Covenant Assembly. The day before the ceremony, I sat alone in my quarters aboard the Unbroken Meridian. I had been in this ship for almost 3 years now. I knew every sound it made. I knew the slight vibration the deck below my bunk that came from the third engine coupling. I knew the particular quality of light in the early morning when the navigation lights cycled through their overnight pattern. I had been in this quarters eating cold noodles when the broadcast started. That felt like it belonged to a different era, and it did, because it was the era that ended that day, and the era that was about to begin the next morning were genuinely different things, and the difference had a name, and the name was engraved on the founding document of a new galactic order. I was not going to pretend that what we had done was simple, or that what came next would be easy. 3 million human dead, dozens of ships, people I had known, people I had served with, people whose names I still said every morning the way Yara had said the Names at the Farpit Memorial from memory without notes because every person deserved to be named properly. We had paid for this. We had paid in the most irreversible currency available. I did not think the cost made what we had built more valuable. I thought it made the obligation to maintain it more serious. The people who died in the threshold battle and in the smaller engagements afterward had not died so that we could build something ordinary. They had died, many of them because they had seen the broadcast and understood that there was no alternative left, and they had made a choice, the same choice Yara had made when she agreed to attend the summit. Knowing what the risk was, I thought about her proposal, 68 pages of careful, thorough, humane reasoning. I thought about the night she must have written the introduction, the first paragraph that started with the sentence, "The purpose of this proposal is not to ask for concessions but to describe, with supporting evidence, what a just arrangement between member species of the Galactic Conclave would require. Not to ask for concessions, to describe what justice required." She had been right that a well-made argument could move the conclave. She had been right that the case was strong enough to be undeniable. What she had not been able to predict was that the conclave would respond not by accepting the undeniable case, but by silencing the person making it, and that in doing so they would accomplish the opposite of what they intended. They had killed her to close a door. She had opened it from the other side. The ceremony the next morning was formal and very long and conducted in 12 languages. Simultaneously, I sat in the front row of the human delegation with Dale on my left and Grace on my right. Elarath sat across from us with the Amory delegation and nodded to me when I caught her eye. When it was time for the human delegation's representative to sign, Grace stepped forward. I had asked her to do it. She had worked with Yara longer than almost anyone else on the team, and she knew the proposal better than I did, and it seemed right that the hand that guided those negotiations should be the hand that signed. She read the signature clause aloud before signing, as the ceremony protocol required. The clause said, "We, the signatory species, commit to the principles of this covenant and acknowledge that its foundation was laid by the sacrifice and the work of those who demanded a just order when it was not yet safe to do so." Then she signed it above the signature line in the space designated for the human delegation's formal representative designation. She had written in her own hand, in addition to her own name, for Commander Yara Solon, Expeditionary Command, Human Species. The room was quiet when she did it. Then, without any orchestration, without any planning, the delegates of 41 species began to stand. I stood too. I looked at the document on the table. I looked at Yara's name on the founding charter of something new. Outside the Renan Waypoint's observation windows, stars were exactly as they had always been, distant, permanent, indifferent to what happened among the small, warm things that moved between them. But the universe was listening. After the ceremony, I went back to my quarters. I sat at my desk. I took Yara's commission badge out of my pocket, the one I had set on the command chair of the Eternal Concordance, and then retrieved the next morning because I was not finished carrying it yet. I held it for a while, then I set it gently on the desk in front of me, and I looked at it, and I said her name once, the way she had taught me, without knowing she was teaching me the way she had taught all of us, which was simply by believing that names matter and that the people who earn them deserve to have them spoken by those who remain. Yara Solon, I said, the stars outside. My porthole did not answer. They never do, but we were not the species we had been 3 years ago, and the galaxy was not the place it had been, and somewhere in the record of what had been built and who had built it, her name was at the top, exactly where it belonged. I picked up the badge, put it back in my pocket, stood up and went back to work.